Just a few days ago, these are the sorts of images that SpaceX aficionados and spaceflight fans in general were thinking about, since the Blue Origin lawsuit had come to an end and NASA and SpaceX were free to move forward with lunar Starship and the human landing system. Our future with Artemis and SpaceX's part of it was really the big thing that people were thinking about and hypothesizing about. What sort of life support systems would SpaceX design? How big would they be? How many astronauts could they take to the moon? It appeared to most of us that future problems with SLS were the big issues that could delay Artemis. These were the things that would put the whole Artemis project at risk, and that a fully reusable vessel that cost a fraction of what SLS cost would be the least of our problems. SpaceX would solve all of our problems as far as going to the moon, and indeed even Mars were concerned. All of the legal wrangling was behind us, and all that remained was for SpaceX to solve all of our problems in returning to the solar system with no barriers in front of them. And then, just a couple of days ago, an explosive email sent by Elon Musk, presumably confidentially to his own employees, surfaced in the media and changed everything. And to everyone's great shock and surprise, the problem lay not with the more sophisticated aspects of Starship, the on-orbit refueling, or the many problems with re-entry and reusing the vessel, but rather with something that we thought was taken care of. If Starship had an Achilles heel, almost nobody outside of the company thought that it was the Raptor engine. It had been performing so well up to this point. However, one thing that is absolutely vital to the success of Starship is mass production. And according to Elon, quote, "The Raptor production crisis is much worse than it seemed a few weeks ago. As we have dug into the issues following the exiting of prior senior management, they have unfortunately turned out to be far more severe than was reported. There is no way to sugarcoat this. Unless you have critical family matters or cannot physically return to Hawthorne, we will need all hands on deck to recover from what is, quite frankly, a disaster." I can't think of stronger language that this man could have used about this problem that virtually nobody knew anything about. But is it really that serious? Well, even if it isn't, this is not a good sign. Now, a few episodes ago, I was advocating for further hop tests of the Starship orbiter, or Starship, if you just want to call it that, especially using all 6 engines instead of just 3, in order to get the whole landing process down, and also perhaps to test the stability of the heat tiles, because they've been running into some problems with vibration and such, and also they've been using different types of heat tiles during the various test flights. So it just seemed to me that while SpaceX was waiting for the FAA to finally come through with approval, performing further hops that didn't require FAA approval made a lot of sense. But ever since this email was released, the truth has become a lot more obvious. SpaceX does not have the Raptor engines to waste on tests like this anymore. And also, you may recall that a few months ago I speculated that SpaceX's lack of activity when it came to further hops and other sorts of flight tests while they were waiting for FAA approval, and also their laser-focused determination on getting to orbit as rapidly as possible, might be a suggestion that they were running out of funding for this project. And now we have this dash to orbit, building this launch tower at an enormous rate of speed, building these Pathfinder super heavies. I mean, from my understanding, we still need another super heavy actually constructed before an orbital launch could even be attempted. Now, during that time, there's a lot of other things that could be done, but they aren't being done. And I have to admit, it does make me wonder, are these things not being done because they can't be done? Because there isn't a budget for that? What there's a budget for currently, especially with the $2.9 billion that NASA promised to SpaceX, now very much in limbo, does SpaceX now need to make it to orbit as desperately as Falcon 1 had to make it to orbit? Not to say that Elon himself is in any danger of going bankrupt. Now, admittedly, at the time, I thought that I was the only one deluded enough to use the words bankruptcy and SpaceX in the same sentence, but now Elon himself is doing it. Let's just go ahead and run through the entire email. Quote, "Unfortunately, the Raptor production crisis is much worse than it had seemed a few weeks ago. As we have dug into the issues following the exiting of prior senior management, they have unfortunately turned out to be far more severe than was reported. There is no way to sugarcoat this. I was going to take this weekend off as my first weekend off in a long time, but instead I will be on the Raptor line all night and through the weekend. Unless you have critical family matters or cannot physically return to Hawthorne, we will need all hands on deck to recover from what is, quite frankly, a disaster. The consequences for SpaceX if we cannot get enough reliable Raptors made is that we then can't fly Starship, which means we then can't fly Starlink satellite V2, and then in parentheses he says Falcon has neither the volume nor the mass to orbit needed for satellite V2, and then satellite V1 by itself is financially weak while V2 is strong. In addition, we are spooling up terminal production to several million units per year, which will consume massive capital, assuming that satellite V2 will be on orbit to handle the bandwidth demand. These terminals will be useless otherwise. What it comes down to is that we face a genuine risk of bankruptcy if we can't achieve a Starship flight rate of at least once every 2 weeks next year. Thanks, Elon." Now, my first reaction to this email was, to be blunt, what the actual... I mean, this makes utterly no sense, and let me tell you why. The FAA application that SpaceX submitted for Boca Chica suggests that there are only going to be 5 orbital flights per year of Starship in 2022, and yet in this same email, Elon is talking about at least 1 Starship flight every 2 weeks in 2022. How the hell does he expect to achieve that without FAA approval? Is he going to fly from Cape Canaveral, perhaps? All of this is quite a mystery. It also leads me to wonder, is this email real? Is this legitimate information? Space.com emphasizes that they have not actually physically seen the email. Unfortunately, in my opinion, if this was a fraud, Elon would have tweeted a response to this already, and he has not. We all need to assume that this email is legitimate. So what does it really mean? Well, first of all, the easiest thing to interpret is the whole reference to senior management having left. That's probably Will Hetzley, who was the SpaceX Senior Vice President of Propulsion. However, the content of the email suggests that this individual and others may have been misreporting the progress that SpaceX had been making on Raptor production, that there may have been some difficulties with the quality of the product or the speed that it can be produced. If that is indeed the case, this is a serious issue because you need 29 Raptors for the Super Heavy and you need 6 Raptors for the Starship itself, a total of 35 engines for every Starship. And until they get reusability completely perfected, they're going to be burning 35 engines with every launch. And that is not going to be an inexpensive thing, and it could very well be a time-consuming thing. So I think we really need to take Elon at face value as far as this email is concerned. It is a very serious problem that threatens not only SpaceX, but also Artemis, given the fact that HLS is exclusively dependent on lunar Starship. But here is another very serious thing that we need to take away from this email. Starlink is losing money, an estimated $1,000 per customer, at least at first. They've launched some new user terminals since then, but they are still losing money on every customer. And keep in mind, Falcon 9 has made many launches in the last year and a half or so, but a lot of those have been Starlink launches that SpaceX has been losing money on. So even though they were recently valued at billions of dollars, is SpaceX in that strong of a financial position? It would appear, according to Elon's statement, that if they don't get this Starlink situation worked out and deployed by Starship, then this rather dire picture that Elon is painting in this email may be a lot more accurate than people are thinking right now. Some people are thinking that Elon is overstating matters, that he's doing these things to motivate his employees to get Starship to orbit faster, that sort of thing. But if that's what he's trying to do, it could be even a more serious sign. But I'll get into that a little bit later. Let's talk a little bit more about the other content of the email and what all of this might mean to SpaceX. In my opinion, the most important thing we can learn from this email by far is just how important Starlink is to the future of SpaceX. Elon is hinging all of his plans, especially Mars, on the amount of money that he intends to make off of this broadband network that he's putting into low Earth orbit. And Starship and the woes with Raptor production are not his only problems anymore. Russia ramped up these problems significantly by firing an anti-sat missile straight into polar orbit, putting an additional 1,500 trackable pieces of debris up there, plus tens of thousands of untrackable pieces of debris. And even the smallest piece of debris can disable a satellite like Starlink. This is a very bad thing indeed. Not only will Starlink not be deployed as quickly as Elon needs it to be deployed if these Raptor engines continued, but even after they're deployed, they could be put into serious jeopardy by what the Russians just did. I have to wonder if the Russians did this intentionally to put our network into a state of chaos because, after all, they don't have a low Earth orbit broadband network of any kind, and they're also less reliant on it than we are. I extrapolated a little bit on that theory in another video that I released recently, and I have that linked at the end of the video. But nevertheless, the situation that we now have in low Earth orbit has put Starlink into a state of jeopardy, even if there were no problems with Starship. And given the fact that the Raptors seem to be encountering a lot of significant problems right now, it makes the situation with Starlink and the revenue that SpaceX desperately depends on very shaky indeed. I really don't think that Elon is exaggerating anything in this email. He really shouldn't be, because he's calling for an all hands on deck in the middle of Thanksgiving weekend. That is an almost unthinkable thing to do in corporate culture in the United States, but he's done it, and I'm confident that Elon would not have done this if things were not this serious. And there's another statement that Elon made that in my opinion is a cause for concern. Quote, "If we cannot get enough reliable Raptors made, is that we can't fly Starship," unquote. Now, the whole thing that I'm taking away from that sentence fragment is the reliable thing. A lot of Raptor engines had to be swapped out during the testing process for SN10, SN11, SN15, all of them. As a result, it makes me wonder just how many flawed Raptors were produced, and whether or not SpaceX has the Raptor production system down pat, or if they are putting out some flawed product in the process. If that is the case, then it's going to slow down production even further. And in the initial stages of testing, during the first orbital launch, we can expect to lose both Super Heavy and the Orbiter. I don't think that either one of them is going to survive, especially if you're going to land Super Heavy in the ocean. So what is likely to happen is the loss of 35 Raptor engines and all of the expense involved with that just with the first orbital test, assuming that it's a complete success. If it isn't, if it explodes in mid-flight, or God forbid on the pad, then you're looking at another 35 engines for another test. The orbital testing process for this vessel, especially if you're pushing it as fast and as furiously as Elon is pushing it at the moment, is going to consume a whole lot of engines. And if you don't have a whole lot of engines to lose, the whole testing process falls apart. And this is probably one of several things that has Elon very upset at the moment. And if I were him, I would be upset as well. But is this really the case? Is Elon just doing what Elon does and painting a dire picture and talking about bankruptcy and things like that in order to get his staff moving again? But if that is indeed the case, that suggests a situation, in my opinion, that could be even more dire than the one that Elon is painting for us right now. This is Howard Hughes, a man who I think bears a tremendous resemblance to Elon Musk. As a matter of fact, I think that some of Howard Hughes' spirit resides in Elon Musk somewhere. Mr. Hughes was equally driven to achieve anything at any cost. He was a genius. He came through with so many aeronautical and aerospace breakthroughs, it's impossible to keep up with all of them. He actually created the first vehicle to land on the moon, the first American vehicle anyway. Few people know that. He accomplished so much, and yet at the cost of his own sanity, and also the sanity of many of his employees. If there's a person that would have called off Thanksgiving for his employees over a perceived problem that was nowhere near as serious as he was thinking that it was, well, that could suggest a level of paranoia and mental instability similar to that which brought down one of the greatest scientific and engineering minds in American history. In Elon's own words, "Only the paranoid survive," and he posted that on November 30th. Does that suggest that Elon himself is paranoid? And just how paranoid is he? Hopefully not that bad. But regardless, I am more comfortable in thinking that Elon is actually being serious about all of this. That Starship and the Raptor program is in a state of crisis, and this crisis needs to be taken care of. He is taking the bull by the horns, and I am confident that he will correct it. But it is a problem. It is a serious problem, and it is one that needs to be rectified before we can even think about Starship becoming a successful program. So let's hope that all of this gets resolved quickly, because if Elon is to be believed, the Raptor is indeed in a state of crisis. If you like what I have to say, if you enjoy this type of content and my shooting from the hip style, well, you know how to support me. It's all in the description. I could certainly use your support or just a like and subscribe. So until we have a successful orbital flight of Starship and this program gets underway for the sake of the future of not only SpaceX, but for the entire human race's ambitions of moving out into the solar system, I urge all of you to stay angry about space.